Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. Greetings and a very warm welcome to the third budget forum organized by the Center for Banking Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So today our expectation is to decode the National Budget 2024 and discuss its impact for the national economy and implementation challenges that might arise along with possible remedies. So today we have a very interesting lineup, starting with the keynote speech to be delivered by Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, Secretary to the Treasury of Minister of Finance. And then we'll be having a panel discussion, which will be contributed by these esteemed panelists. We have Mr. Deshal Dimel, Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance. And we have Mr. Mal Jayasinghe, Member of the Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka, and immediate past President of CS Sri Lanka. And we have Dr. Kingsley Bernard, Chairman, Chief Executive Officer of Sri Lanka Export Development Board. And we have Mr. Bingumal Tevaratanti, Chief Executive Officer, Standard Chartered Bank of Sri Lanka. Then we have Mr. Sujiv Mudrige, former Managing Partner of PwC Sri Lanka. And the panel discussion will be moderated by Mr. Shamindra Kulamanage, co-founder and editor at Echelon Media. We warmly welcome all of you, ESS. So today we have a very good participation in our virtual audience, joining via both Zoom and Facebook page. So please start interacting with the discussion and direct your questions to us. You can use the Q&A option in the Zoom platform, and also you can use the comment section of the Facebook live streaming to post your questions. We will try to accommodate your questions as much as possible, given the interest of time. So at this moment, we are also joined by the Senior Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mrs. Yvette Fernando. So without further ado, let me now invite Madam Senior Deputy Governor, Mrs. Yvette Fernando, to deliver opening remarks of the forum and also to introduce the keynote speaker today. Madam, over to you.
Thank you, Kushan. Good afternoon to all. It is my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker for today, Mr. K. Mahinda Siriwardana, Secretary to the Treasury and Ministry of Finance, Economic Stabilization and National Policies. The esteemed panelists representing various sectors of the economy, as well as the moderator of today's event, and all the participants of this post-budget forum organized by the Center for Banking Studies of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. I sincerely thank each of you for accepting the invitation and joining us virtually this afternoon. This forum marks the third post-budget forum organized by the Center for Banking Studies, aimed at fostering meaningful discussions to enhance understanding of the national budget for 2024 and to highlight the necessity of collaboration among the key stakeholders. The announcement of the annual budget of the government is a highly anticipated and pivotal event for any country. The public, business community, and international agencies eagerly await its unveiling, attentively analyzing the prospects, impacts it holds for each other. We all know that when formulating a budget, a government must take into account a multitude of factors. This involves the challenging endeavor of strategically planning and overseeing the financial resources of the government. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka firmly believes that sustained dialogue with essential stakeholders is imperative for the seamless execution of the budget proposals. Therefore, in line with this commitment, we bring you this forum to emphasize the requirement to facilitate the execution of government policies and foster overall development of the nation. Ultimately, the attainment of prosperity is a collective endeavor that cannot be pursued in isolation. It necessitates a harmonious collaboration among diverse entities, including the government, central bank, the business community, and most importantly, the public. The purpose of this forum is to enhance awareness of budget proposals for 2024 and actively engage with the perspective of business and the public. So the objective of today's post-budget forum is to discuss the potential impact of the budget proposals presented by the Honorable Minister of Finance yesterday on different sectors of the economy and to assess how these would shape the economy as a whole. It is my sincere aspiration that this objective will be realized through meaningful discussions and shared insights, which we expect from today's exclusive discussion. So before concluding my remarks, let me thank once again the Secretary to the Treasury and all the members of the panel and the moderator for your time and contribution to this online forum and for your knowledge, opinions, and experience that you would be sharing with us today. With that, I would like to now invite Mr. K.M. Mahinda Sirivardhana, Secretary to the Treasury and Minister of Finance, to deliver the keynote speech. Mr. Sirivardhana has been serving as the Secretary to the Treasury since April 2022. He has more than 30 years of service in the central bank. Prior to his appointment as Deputy Governor at the central bank, he held the key positions of Assistant Governor and Director of Economic Research Department of the Central Bank. Mr. Sirivardhana was on release to the International Monetary Fund as the alternate Executive Director for the constituency comprised of India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan during July 2017 to October 2019. He was also on release to the Ministry of Finance from October 2010 to April 2015 to serve as the Director General of the Fiscal Policy Department and also as an Additional Director General of the National Planning Department. Mr. Sirivardhana has served as a member of the Board of Directors of the Treasury Representative in several institutions, including Bank of Ceylon, Commercial Bank of Ceylon, National Savings Bank, Sri Lanka Ports Authority, Board of Investment of Sri Lanka, Export Development Board, Sri Lanka Export Credit Insurance Corporation, and Sri Lanka Vocational Training Authority. He holds a Master of Arts degree in Economics and a postgraduate diploma in Economic Development from the Vanderbilt University, USA, and a Bachelor of Arts special degree in Economics from the University of California. Over to you, Mr. Sirivardhana.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank the Director and staff of the Center for Banking Studies of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka for inviting me to deliver the keynote speech at this webinar on the Government Budget 2024. Budget 2024 marks another crucial milestone in Sri Lanka's path of economic stabilization and growth. Since the last budget was presented in November 2022, the country has come a long way. Since then, we have seen considerable improvements on the fiscal, monetary, and external economy fronts. On the fiscal aspects, government tax revenue has grown by 50% in the first half of 2023 compared to the corresponding period in 2022. More importantly, the country has achieved a primary surplus in the first half of 23, following a primary deficit of 5.7% of GDP in 2021. Arrears have also been controlled and now effectively being eliminated. State-owned enterprise reforms are beginning to bear fruit. In 2022, the 52 large SOEs accounted for a collective loss of 722 billion in the first 8 months of 2022. But this has converted into a profit of 313 billion in the corresponding period of this year. Inflation was reduced from 70% in September 22 to 1.5% in October 23 due to the coordinated macroeconomic demand management efforts of the central bank and the government. supported by supply side improvements. Usable foreign exchange reserves, which were around $20 million in mid-April 22, have now recovered substantially. Today, gross official reserves exceed $3.5 billion. The improved foreign exchange liquidity in the banking system have enabled the normalization of supply chains and basic consumption. Whilst the results of the reform agenda put in place since mid-2022 are indeed encouraging, we all are still in relatively early stages of a long and difficult road to a complete recovery. The economy has stabilized significantly compared to where we were last year, but nobody can claim that the stability is fully entrenched. There is no room for complacency and deviate from this reform path. It is in this context that the 24 budget is being closely watched, not just by the citizens of Sri Lanka, but also by our global development partners, including the IMF and crucially Sri Lanka's external creditors. The budget required a careful navigation of several competing objectives. First, it was necessary to ensure continued adherence to the fiscal consolidation path to ensure macroeconomic stability. Secondly, it was equally important to recognize the pain felt by citizens and to provide some degree of relief, particularly to the most vulnerable groups. Finally, it was also crucial to take the first steps in shifting from stabilization to economic growth and putting the economy on a fresh path of better quality growth. I believe the budget that was presented on Monday has been able to strike the appropriate balance between these competing objectives. The budget ensures a balance of revenue and expenditures to enable a primary surplus of 0.8% of GDP in 2024. Revenue growth is ensured by measures already introduced, and significant attention is paid to enhancing tax administration, compliance, and digitalization. Revenue growth in 24 is ensured by measures already introduced and reforms to the VAT structure in particular. Amendments to VAT Act have been submitted to the Parliament, which will significantly expand the VAT base. The vast majority of VAT exemptions will be eliminated, and this will significantly add to revenue in 2024. The already announced increase in the VAT rate will also have a material revenue impact. At the same time, the elimination of import restrictions, except for passenger motor vehicles, will result in normalization of imports in 2024. This will also have a significant upside on border taxes and VAT as well as special social security contribution levy from imports in 2024. With the recent changes, the tax structure is largely in place with a focus on few core taxes, such as corporate and personal income tax, VAT, and core excises on alcohol, tobacco, and fuel. The government's focus now is on enhancing tax administration, compliance, and digitalization. It is important to understand that Sri Lanka's tax administration structure is saddled with deep, long-standing legacy issues. The weaknesses in Revenue Administration Management Information System, RAMIS, it is a system introduced in 2013, is a reflection of this. There is an urgent need for institutional reform, digitalization, and change in practices. These constraints cannot be resolved overnight, but we have to start somewhere. At present, a comprehensive effort to improve tax administration and compliance reform is ongoing. Many of these measures are reflected in the budget, such as digitalization, risk-based audits, expanding team coverage, and so on. There are several initiatives taking place in parallel, many of which are also covered under the IMF and World Bank reform programs. We are confident that the combination of widening the VAT base, increase in VAT rate, removal of import restrictions, recovery of economic activity, and in particular tax administration efforts, the revenue required to support the 2024 budget will be met. This will enable us to meet the IMF's primary balance target of 0.8% of GDP and ensure the program remains on track. To talk about some information about the debt restructuring, following this budget, the next critical milestone would be the next steps in the process of external debt restructuring. Sri Lanka has asked its external creditors to accept significant losses in their holdings of Sri Lankan debt. Creditors will be keeping a close eye on this budget to assess whether Sri Lanka is keeping on its commitments in establishing fiscal consolidation as the country's contribution towards achieving debt sustainability. Sri Lanka has already provided all groups of creditors with indicative restructuring scenarios that will enable the achievement of the debt reduction targets set by the IMF. That is the reduction of debt to GDP ratio from 128% of GDP in 22 to less than 95% of GDP in 2032, reduction of gross financing needs from 34.6% of GDP in 22 to less than 13% of GDP on average during 32 period, and restricting external debt service to GDP from 9.4% in 22 to less than 4.5% in 27-32 period. It is now up to the external creditors to come to an agreement with Sri Lankan authorities on a debt treatment that help achieve these targets. China Exim Bank has already come to an understanding with Sri Lanka regarding such a debt treatment. The next step would be for the official creditor committee, co-chaired by Japan, India, and France, to provide a similar understanding. We are very hopeful that this will be materialized soon. At that point, the IMF will be able to assess whether the debt treatments are sufficient to meet the targets and whether they meet the requirements of comparability of treatment. This would enable the IMF Executive Board to approve the first review and unlock the next tranche of financing. The budget would need to be in line with agreed macroeconomic reform parameters to ensure both the IMF and external creditors are happy to proceed. The continuity of the IMF program and debt restructuring process is crucial to ensure global confidence in the Sri Lankan economy, enabling the country to continue to engage in trade finance and regular financial market transactions. Talking about financial sector stability, a crucial pillar in Sri Lanka's macroeconomic reform program is ensuring the stability of the financial sector. During times of economic stress, there's typically an increase in pressure on financial sector stability. The domestic debt optimization process has had material impact on the balance sheets of the state banks in particular. In order to ensure continued strength of the banking sector, the government has proactively allocated 450 billion rupees towards recapitalization of the relevant entities. There is also an allocation of 3,000 million, that is 3 trillion, to provide for the issue of new restructured USD bonds in exchange for existing international sovereign bonds. Both the above allocations are financed in a manner that will not disrupt the domestic rupee fixed income market. The bank recapitalization allocation is more than enough to ensure the banking sector remains stable and well capitalized. However, in parallel, a number of governance and regulatory reforms for the banking sector are being implemented. This includes enhanced disciplines on appointments of key management personnel and boards of state banks, tighter restrictions in terms of single borrower limits and other credit risk parameters, and other measures to ensure the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Following the economic stabilization measures, the other key objective of the budget was to provide an affordable and sustainable level of relief to the public. Toward this end, the provisions for social safety nets have been increased, targeting the poorest and most vulnerable households. Public sector salaries and pensions have been adjusted to the extent possible given the prevailing fiscal constraints. Central bank data indicates that the private sector has seen some wages adjustment in response to inflation over the last 2 years, but public sector wages have remained static. The CBSL private sector wage index has increased by 25% between January 22 and August 23, while public sector wage index has not changed with zero growth according to the same measures. The adjustment of public sector wages addresses this to some extent whilst ensuring fiscal targets remain intact. It has, however, not been possible to provide relief on tax measures at this stage. Government revenue collection remains below target levels, and it is the aggregate target that is watched closely by the IMF and external creditors. In a context where revenue is below target and where the tax reforms have been in place for less than a year, it has become very difficult to defend a reduction in taxes, particularly those affect the top 20% of income earners in the country. Any reduction on one type of taxes would have to be matched by an increase in a different tax to maintain the aggregate revenue target intact. What are the results of tax administration and compliance reform begin to bear fruit? The aggregate tax targets can be met. It will be possible to revisit some relief in terms of tax liability. Finally, the budget also needed to provide the stepping stone for a shift from economic stabilization to growth. A sustainable economic growth level is a crucial component of the overall debt sustainability and fiscal stability framework. Going forward, growth would also need to break from the past trends of debt finance growth driven by the non-tradable sector. The economic growth is expected to recover in 2024 due to the improved macroeconomic environment. Interest rates have declined to less than half the levels of 2022. Inflation has been restored at single-digit levels. Elimination of import restrictions will address past supply chain bottlenecks, and there will be some pent-up demand in the economy as well. The expected conclusion of the external debt restructuring process will address any residual uncertainty in the economic outlook as well. The budget provides further impetus to this through targeted measures to address key sectors such as construction, exports, agriculture, logistics, SMEs, and so on. The budget sets out the framework to support growth led by non-debt creating inflows. Particular reference is made to integration with global markets for trade and investment, expansion of free trade agreements, improving trade facilitation measures, addressing supply-side bottlenecks are key elements outlined in the budget. Addressing the constraints to investment promotion are also articulated, particularly in terms of access to land, raw materials, skills development, and so on. A new agency, which is in the final stages of being established, will provide oversight to the development and promotion of trade and investment. Supporting the other areas, including tourism industry, creative economy, and gig economy activities also has given the due attention. Growth must also be inclusive. That is why a lot of emphasis is placed on the integration of the rural economy and SMEs into broader value chains. This applies to the agricultural modernization agenda in particular, but also the SME sector. The budget provides significant levels of support to the SME sector through a comprehensive strategy to address financing constraints, capacity development, and market access. Special attention is provided to youth-led and women-led SMEs in this regard. The budget also articulates the digital journey that the country is expected to embark on, along with ensuring growth is driven by principles of sustainability and the green economy. Digitalization of the economy has important fiscal implications as well by helping the economy shift away from cash transactions to more traceable transactions. It also enables better targeting and delivery of welfare measures. In the past, wherever Sri Lanka has undergone a reform period in stabilization is achieved, the tendency has been to slip back into old habits. The country can no longer afford such slippage in the absence of economic buffers to withstand any further shocks. Therefore, it is essential that legislation is put in place that helps locking the reforms that are being implemented. The Ministry of Finance is in advanced stages of drafting the Public Finance Management Bill. The PFM legislation provides the legal framework to support the ongoing fiscal reforms. This includes robust fiscal rules, enhanced discipline on budgetary processes, developing the medium-term fiscal framework, improved transparency, and clear oversight on budget execution. The legislation is expected to be placed in early 2024. In addition to the PFM law, there will be other legislation, including the Public Debt Management Law, Procurement Law, SOE Law, PPP Law, among others, which are expected to lock in the fiscal reforms being implemented. However, we are very well aware that legislation alone is not sufficient to drive meaningful change. Sri Lanka's experience with the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act legislation of 2023 is testament to that. Therefore, along with the legislation, it is essential that all stakeholders, that is the parliament, government officials, civil society, academia, the media, and the general public all become stakeholders in this process to support the implementation of PFM bill and other legislation to ensure that fiscal discipline in the country remains on track into the long term. In 2024 budget, make a significant break from the past. Over the years, Sri Lanka has expected successive government to play a major role in all aspects of the economy, from commercial activity to providing social welfare and being the employer of last resort. However, tax revenues have declined at the same time, leading to a steady buildup of debt, which eventually was no longer sustainable, resulting in an unprecedented economic crisis. To avoid a cycle of repeat crises in the future, it is necessary for Sri Lanka to change its social contract. The 24 budget sets the foundation for such a shift in the economic path of the country. This also requires a major shift in terms of governance. Sri Lanka has become the first country in Asia to conduct a comprehensive independent diagnostic of governance structures and corruption vulnerabilities. Many of the findings of this diagnostic are already being addressed through a comprehensive action plan. Corruption must be eliminated, and all stakeholders must work together to reset Sri Lanka's governance culture. Sri Lanka once again finds itself at a crucial crossroad. The country can continue along the reform path that has enabled the country to gradually emerge from this deep economic crisis, or we can take shortcuts and seek unsustainable relief and deviate from this path. The second option will no doubt lead to a return to a crisis far worse than what we collectively experienced in 2022. The implementation of the budget proposals is critically important to achieve desired outcomes, and stakeholder contribution will be crucial in this regard. Hence, as professionals, it is our responsibility to help navigate the country through this challenging period towards a sustainable economic path that will provide prosperity for all citizens in the medium to long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that comprehensive keynote in which the rationale behind the national budget 2024 was very clearly explained. So thank you very much for joining with us. It's busy schedules. We are very much grateful, sir. So with that, we are now ready to go ahead with the panel discussion. So let me spend 2 minutes in introducing the panelists today. We have Mr. Deshal Dimel, Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Dimel is an economist who has experience across government, private sector, and academy. He's, as I said earlier, an economic advisor to the Minister of Finance, and prior to which he worked in the corporate sector as a senior economist at the Haley's Group. He was a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka in 2018 and 2019. He has previously served on a number of corporate and non-corporate boards. His publications can be found in a number of books and journals. Mr. Dimel was recognized by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader in 2019. Then we have Mr. Manil Jayasinghe. Mr. Jayasinghe is having over 41 years of advisory and industry experience across key sectors in Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bhutan. He was a country managing partner of Ernst & Young Sri Lanka and Maldives from 2021 to 2023, head of assurance practice in Sri Lanka, and the profession practice director of Sri Lanka from 2023 to 2023. So 2003 to 2023. He was a key resource in banks, financial and insurance service of Ernst & Young, Sri Lanka, with field of experience in financial instruments. He has extensive experience in all other industries, including manufacturing, retail, hospitality, wholesale business, and telecommunication. He is the immediate past president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka. Then we have Dr. Kingsley Bernard. Dr. Kingsley Bernard is currently the chairman, chief executive officer of Sri Lanka Export Development Board and counts over 40 years of experience in the corporate sector in Sri Lanka. He has held senior and top management positions in organizations both in public and private sectors. He was an active member of the trade chambers in Sri Lanka and was the president of National Chamber of Exporters for 2 consecutive years from 2004 to 2006. He also led the Joint Business Forum, which was the umbrella organization for major trade chambers in Sri Lanka during 2005-2006. He was also the Vice President of Exporters Association of Sri Lanka, affiliated to the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and the first President of Sri Lanka Economic Manufacturers and Exporters Association. Then we have Mr. Bingumal Thevaratantri. Mr. Bingumal, better known as Bingu, was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of Standard Chartered Bank, Sri Lanka on January 2019. He is the first Sri Lankan national to be appointed to this position. Apart from his role as CEO, Mr. Bingumal also heads Sri Lanka's commercial, corporate, and institutional banking business. Having joined Standard Chartered in July 2004, Mr. Bingu counts for more than 25 years of experience within banking and finance industry. During his tenure at Standard Chartered, he has led several leadership positions in Sri Lanka and Africa. He was elected as Deputy Vice Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce in 2023 and 2024, and serves as the Chairman of Sri Lanka Banks Association. Then we have Mr. Sujiv Mudalige. Mr. Mudalige counts over 25 years of experience as a chartered accountant and has vast experience as the audit committee chair in both public and private sector organizations. He recently retired as the managing partner of PwC. He is a past president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka and serves as a commission member of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka. So we warmly welcome all these respected panelists to the panel discussion. And this discussion, as I mentioned earlier, will be moderated by Mr. Shamindra Pulamanige. Mr. Shamindra is the co-founder and publisher at Ishal Media, a print and digital media company. Ishal Media publishes Ishalan, a business and innovation brand, and EconomyNext.com, Sri Lanka's top financial and economic news product, and Neon, a local language multimedia news product. Shamindra has been a financial journalist for 2 decades, and in the last decade, a media entrepreneur. So with that, now I cordially invite Mr. Shamindra to take over the session and commence the panel discussion. Shamindra, over to you.
Thank you. A warm welcome to everybody and good afternoon. Here is a brief note on how we'll conduct this discussion. I think it has been the view of the central bank, and I think we have an illustrious panel here. So at the outset, we will allow each of the panelists to take some time, between 5 to 10 minutes, to set out their initial thoughts towards the discussion. And in that time, the participants, and we have very many, so right now online on Zoom, you're welcome to post questions on the Q&A tab of the Zoom app, and I'll go through them and I'll take as many of them. Please be brief and precise with your questions. In terms of an order on how we might get about this, we will start with the widest possible view. So next to after the Secretary to the Treasury has spoken, I think we will invite Deshal to go first. Then I will invite Sujiva Mudalige to make opening remarks. Then Mr. Banenjaya Singha I will invite. Then I will invite Kingsley Bernard from the EDB. And then I will come to Bingumal for those opening remarks. So without further ado, may I invite Deshal, please make your opening remarks.
Thank you, Shamindra, and thank you to CBS for inviting me to speak today. So I think ST covered a good perspective of the budget from a macroeconomic perspective in terms of the challenges that we have to face. So I'm not going to go into too much detail at the risk of repetition. But if we try to focus on a couple of areas that I think require a little bit more clarity. In terms of some of the questions that have been raised immediately after the budget. So at the outset, I think it's important to acknowledge that the budget that was presented on Monday was a very challenging one in terms of the requirement to balance a number of competing objectives. So first and most importantly, it was crucial that the budget was able to ensure that we are able to remain on our macroeconomic recovery path, particularly in terms of meeting the fiscal target. So that was the most significant initial challenge that had to be overcome. And second was the need to address the hardships that are being faced by a large subset of a large segment of the population, particularly the most poor and vulnerable groups. And that is again an urgent requirement that in effect can compete with the first objective of fiscal consolidation. And then finally, it was also important for the budget to set the foundations for long-term growth. And that is again crucial because without economic growth, the overall fiscal targets can get undermined, as would the debt sustainability targets as well. So the stimulation of growth also becomes a very important pillar, and that again can compete with the fiscal objectives at the outset. So these three kind of broadly is the balancing act that the budget had to try to balance effectively, and to an extent, I think that has been achieved. But let me focus specifically with regard to the fiscal targets, particularly with regard to the revenue side, because I think there has been some commentary and some concerns as to whether the expenditure that has been proposed would that be is it possible to meet that with the revenue that is expected. Now, we all noticed that in the budget speech itself, there is not a lot of reference to revenue measures, largely because most of the revenue measures that are expected for 2024 have already been announced or already in place. So even in the IMF program documents from March 2023, what you can see that the heavy lifting for revenue in 2024 largely comes from VAT. Both from a base widening aspect and from a rate perspective. So that is still the objective that we have, where VAT is the biggest contributor to the revenue gains in the coming year. So this happens from a few different aspects. So first of all, we know that the VAT rate is going to go up from 15% to 18%. That was announced in the public domain a couple of weeks ago. And secondly, the expansion of the VAT base. Now, already the VAT Act has been submitted. Amendments to the VAT Act have been submitted to Parliament, where there's a substantial removal of VAT exemptions that is already in the amendment. There will be also committee stage amendments that have also been submitted by the Ministry of Finance to Parliament, which will address a fairly comprehensive expansion of the VAT base. So those two aspects are the big drivers of revenue: the rate increase and the base expansion for value-added tax. The second aspect, from a policy perspective, is the fact that next year we will see a normalization of imports. So this is not to say that imports are going to go up 3-4 times what we have seen in the past, but it's basically coming back to coming close to pre-crisis levels. I say close to pre-crisis levels because still you have the restriction on passenger motor vehicles, but other than that, all of the import restrictions have been removed. So by next year, you'll see this degree of normalization, which again is supportive from a revenue perspective, both from the border taxes like customs import duty, PAL, etc., but also from the import component of VAT and the import component of the social security levy. The other aspect which we expect to contribute to revenue growth next year would be the tax administration measures. Now, as ST quite rightly pointed out, there is the tax admin typically takes some time to convert into material revenue flow impact. But given the fact that we are starting from a fairly low base with regard to a fairly weak system as it is, there is upside that we can see. There's some upside we can see in the short term as well. And now some measures have already been mentioned in the budget speech, but there's actually a lot more that is being done in parallel, which we'd expect to start to contribute to revenue from next year itself. And then, of course, what is important is that we are going to see next year a recovery in economic activity as well. And that is, we are seeing evidence for that from the high frequency indicators that the central bank publishes, particularly in terms of PMIs on the services side. So that I think we can expect to continue to gather momentum into 2024 as well. And then, of course, another important aspect is the fact that in 2024 is when you're going to see the full impact from corporate income tax as well, because in this year. You're still seeing the 2022 earnings being reflected to some part for some part of the 2023 income, but you're going to see that the full year benefit of CIT and PIT coming into collection in 2024. So that's another boost that we can expect. And finally, the lower interest rates would also support corporate bottom lines in terms of lower finance costs. That's been one of the biggest drivers of profit compression this year. That should also be reversed to some extent in 2024. So all these factors we expect to contribute to revenue enhancement in 2024. So based on this, we expect the revenue targets to be met in a comfortable manner. Let me also touch a little bit upon expenditure. So if you look at the drivers for the increased expenditure, more than 75% of the increase can be explained by the increase in interest cost and the capital expenditure increase, including the bank recap. So the interest cost, of course, is something that is out of the control of current policy. It is the cost of past interest, but you can see the rise in capex is again one of the factors that it's a clear reflection of the attempt to stimulate growth in 2024. So that again is a necessary increase that we have. So it's the increase in expenditure has been controlled in that manner. And also, if you look at the funding for most of the expenditure proposals has already been programmed into the appropriation bill itself. So if you look at, for example, some of the big ticket items like the cost of living allowance for the public sector workers, pensions increases, and so on, they were already reflected in the appropriations bill, but under the miscellaneous vote of the Department of National Budget. Right? So it's not so that all those expenditure has been factored in at that early stage, and the revenue measures for that were already planned from even before speech. So just to, I think what the key point here is that the expenditure proposals that are outlined in the budget have really been fully addressed from a revenue perspective. So the budget proposals are, I would say, safely on track to meet the key IMF primary balance target for 2024. I think another point that there was some confusion or maybe a lack of clarity was with regard to was the question of with the bank recapitalization allocation of 450 billion, whether that would have an impact on the primary balance target. So here the IMF at the get-go at the time of program approval, the IMF agreed to not include the any bank recap related expenditure in the primary balance calculation. So there again, the target of 0.8% of GDP primary balance can be met based on the budget that has been presented. And finally, there was also some questions with regard to the increase of the borrowing ceiling, and that's going to add to financing costs and so on. But here, as ST also mentioned, the provision of 3 trillion rupees, the increase is for the issue of new restructured USD bonds to be exchanged with the old instruments. So from a net perspective, there isn't an increase. The increase is only from a gross perspective. So there won't be any impact on the fixed income market in terms of attempting to finance this. So let me pause there, and happy to come back later with any further questions. Thank you.
Shamindra, you're on mute, Shamindra.
Thank you, Deshal. Sujeeva Mudalike, may I invite you to make opening remarks?
Thank you. So thank you to CBS for inviting me. First of all, I think we must thank both the Finance Ministry and the Central Bank for normalizing the economy from where we were 12 to 15 months ago. Incredible job done under very difficult and trying circumstances. I mean, excellent outcome at this stage. So we need to keep that in mind. Current environment in which the President Wickremesinghe, as the Finance Minister, has presented the 78 budget. A couple of things which I see as positives, and I will also comment on some of the comments, observations made by Desha. So, I mean, there's significant focus on the primary fact that we got to live within our means. which we haven't done over the last 75 years or so, and successive governments have not been able or have been giving up, whether it's handouts, whether it's subsidies, whether it's concessions, freebies, whatever you call it, well beyond what we could afford. So I think when you read the preamble from President Vikramasinghe's speech yesterday, right at the very beginning, he clearly mentioned it's time for us to live within our means, and I'm glad that there is commitment from the head of state for fiscal austerity. I think that, that's a point which I want to really drive in, is that to the Ministry of Finance and also to central bank, if there is no commitment on fiscal austerity, I think in my view, it's a matter of time between the next 4 to 5 years, we would have a second round of debt restructuring. And that is inevitable if there is no fiscal austerity. And I'm so happy that this was mentioned over and over again by President Vikramasinghe yesterday, and also today in his opening remarks by the ST, which is excellent news. So that's something that we need to actually congratulate for taking that stand. And it's also clear, Shamindra, that this budget has been very well sort of planned and laid out and on the EFF parameters. So that has been taken into account, and that could be, and we could read it between the lines, but right throughout the proposals, that the EFF parameters have been have had a significant sort of impact and bearing on the outcome of the proposals. As usual, I have my doubts on the revenue proposals. I mean, we all know from, if you take year 2000, I don't want to go beyond that. If you take the last 23 years, we have never met the revenue targets. We have always fallen short, and we have exceeded the expenditure allocations. So it has been two-pronged, lower on revenue, higher on expenditure. So I hope that we will get pretty close to the revenue targets that has been laid out. It's going to be tough, but I think we should all support that. So that's a significant factor in this budget. One thing I also see is that, in my view, under the current circumstances, there is excess budgeting for capital expenditure. I think it will be extremely difficult to spend that amount of money on the proposed capex that has been envisaged. So I feel there could be some savings there, which you may be able to reallocate as we go along. And one other thing is, we need to keep in mind, I think the President Vikramasinghe also mentioned this yesterday, we are going to have 2 elections next year. So it's quite a change from previous pre-election budgets, where we have all seen handouts, freebies, you just name it, right? None of them are there in this budget. So credit to, again, to the Finance Ministry team and also to President Vikramasinghe for not using the 2024 budget as an election budget. I mean, knowing that there will be 2 elections within the next 12 months. There's a lot of emphasis on a digital economy, which is fantastic. Bit disappointed that we have not been able to do the digital ID still. We have been talking about it, but hopefully I'll see some allocation being made for some of the new institutions to come on board. I hope this is a 12-month exercise for us, and we should be able to complete this by 2024. And a lot of things which we have not been able to do in the past will fall into place if we can get this done. But I have my doubts whether this could be done because of so many other external factors. We have been struggling to avoid this tender for quite some time now, but I hope we can sort those issues out. But that's a real critical element, whether it's to enhance revenue, whether it's to enhance the tax base, whether it's to bring people into the net, keep a tab on their managing of wealth and so on. So that's a critical element. I want to just touch a few things on the expenditure side, because this is something generally panelists don't want to talk about, and because this is the most unpopular thing. But as you know, our expenditure has also kept going up over the years, and there is no slowing down on the expenditure side. So I just want to see some of the numbers which I'm going to read out from one of the reports from Verite, which was just released yesterday after the budget speech. Is, see, if you take a certain expenditure, right? I just want to touch on. I mean, in 2022, we had a power and energy allocation of 267 billion, and this year the allocation is 43 billion. I believe because of the tariffs being increased and cost reflective pricing, there is no need, but I hope that's the case. I mean, it's a significant reduction from 267 billion to 43 billion. Women and social empowerment had 174 billion allocated last year. We have only 75 billion this year. But the biggest disappointment, as usual, is actually on defense, right? Defense has gone up from 2022 in 465 billion in 2022 to 555 billion, 553 billion in 2023, and 564 billion in 2024. And why this we need to look at this. I don't know how many of you all are aware, right? We have in the education sector and health, I have no doubt we need to increase the allocation that has been given to both those sectors. We have about 225,000 teachers and principals. I think that number needs to be increased. There is enough cases where the ministers have been asking for additional resources, especially to the provincial schools and also Tamil-speaking schools. In the Triforces, some interesting statistics. We have 230,000 in the Triforces. We have 85,000. I read it somewhere in the budget speech. In the police, that is 315,000. And we have home guards of another 26,000. Right? So we are talking about 330,000 people after the end of the war in 2009, which is 15 years gone. And I haven't seen a single policy paper how we can resize our military, our Triforces over a period of time. And we are fully aware we can't do this overnight. I think we need like a 10-year plan. How are we going to resize the defense expenditure and the defense forces? I simply don't think we can carry 300,000 people. It's simply not possible. When our allocation to health and education is wanting, right? One other thing, Shamin, right, whether you knew, we have 92,000 Samurdhi and development officers. 100,000. I mean, these are all what? Foot soldiers of political parties. These are foot soldiers of political parties. And you and I are paying higher taxes, and the corporates are paying higher taxes to carry these foot soldiers. And there is nothing in the budget speech where we are going to retrain these people, and how do we make them far more, how can we get them to contribute to our economy? So that's just one side on the expenditure side, and also it's an alarming number on the interest cost, right? We need to keep that in mind. And 2 trillion borrowing from the domestic side, that's a substantial level of borrowing, and also the total interest cost has virtually gone through the roof over the last 2-3 years, and we of course we know the reasons. One other thing before I conclude is that really happy to see, I think Deshal touched on this, is the 450 billion that is being given to strengthen the banking sector. We've all talked about the need to strengthen the banking sector, including the 2 state banks, and very happy to see the funds being allocated for that purpose, because this has been a long time coming, which is something that, because at any cost, making sure that our banking sector is stable is absolutely critical. One other thing which before I conclude is something which I want to do on policy consistency. I mean, I wouldn't want to go into too much detail. I'll just tell you how we have played around with the VAT rate, right? Just over the last 5 years. In 2015, we had a standard rate of 11. I mean, it just shows that it's how difficult it is to do business here in Sri Lanka. 2015, we had a standard rate of 11. And for the first 5 months of 2016, we had a standard rate of 11. Then in 2016, we changed it to 15%. Then again, towards the end of the year, the standard rate was brought down to 11%. Then during 2016 to 2019, the standard rate went up to 15. Then 2019 to 2022, the standard rate came down from 15 to 8%. Then last year, the 8% went up to 12%. And this year, we had 15%. Next year, we had 18%. Shamindra, hopefully, when we have a chat in 2025, take my word, it will not be 18%, it would have changed again. That's how inconsistent we are on policies. And it's so difficult for businesses to plan out, to forecast. I'm just giving you one simple element where these rates are being changed without sort of consultation, without due notice, and it's extreme. And as you know, this has a significant bearing on doing business. So one thing which I would urge the government and the policymakers is that we need policy consistency. And I just gave you how the VAT rates have changed over the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, there was 7 or 8 changes over a period of 7 to 8 years. And just as my last point, very happy to see significant emphasis on the higher education side, on the universities, and I'm someone who's really passionate on that. The new universities being set up, I hope there will be adequate funding, overseas universities to be set up here. And I'm also aware the government has already approved 4 medical schools to be set up here in Sri Lanka over the next 12 months. Happy to see IIT from Chennai being canvassed to set up here. Unfortunately, this is something that we had done, which I was made to understand today in the morning, that the initial discussions with them happened in 2007. So we are 15 years late, but I'm glad that better late than never, we have started the discussions back again. So that's an excellent sort of focus to on the tertiary education side. So something really good. I'll leave it at that, Shamil, for the moment.
Thank you, Sujiva Mudalige. In fact, Sujiva, in addition to the standard rates for VAT, Sri Lanka has and also the zero rate, Sri Lanka has had also luxury rates for VAT at various times at various percentages. So fairly complicated and constantly changing. Thank you. Manil Jayasinghe, may I invite you to make opening remarks?
Thank you, Shamil, and thank you to CBS for inviting me. I think my previous 2 panelists has covered a good part of the budget and the proposals, but one area that probably I would like to focus on is the investment side of it to some extent, because that from a corporate sense, I think the corporates need to sort of focus on these investment side and then get their businesses focused on capitalizing or taking benefits from those areas of development. So if you look at the budget broadly, I think the first area was on the bank recapitalization, which is, I think, a very important factor, because the lifeline on any economy is the banking sector, and stabilizing that and making sure that they are able to lend to the economy to keep the economic activity moving forward is critical. All the debt restructuring and all that is, I call it point of time, but the critical part is to keep the economy moving forward. Otherwise, as Sujiva mentioned, we will, in another few years' time, we will have another restructure that is going to take place. So capitalizing and strengthening the financial services and banking sector is critical, which I think has been addressed in the budget. In addition to that, I think there are certain thrust areas that the budget is focusing on. The food and beverage sector, it's focusing on milk and milk production, which will again help in that investment going into those areas, which should help entities in those areas to actually focus and capitalize on the opportunities that will come through. The other area would be on the agriculture sector, which Sri Lanka, being Sri Lanka, we are predominantly an agricultural nation, but unfortunately, numbers don't really reflect that. Primarily, I think because of the lack of investment going into that, and also the investment going, but not in the right direction. So here, there is some hope in that they are focusing on allocating, I think, 2.5 trillion on the Maha season, and then converting these agrarian research centers into or modernizing them, then also releasing lands for cultivation in large-scale cultivation in Mahabali and B zones, and of course the Land Reform Commission for extensive agriculture. So all these should basically, I think, help entities in fertilizer and in other agrarian production in order for them to capitalize on some of these initiatives, which they should do. Then we have the tourism sector. It is government has given, I think, an indication that they are going to modernize 3,700 rooms and things like that. But today I was at another discussion. So the immediate thing is, what are the incentives given to the tourism sector? I think Saturday, I think Suji was in another forum, and again he was talking about the debt that this tourism sector has in the banking system, and how we are going to repay. So in that light, this tourism is the low-hanging fruit. If you ask me, in our economy, we can easily expand or increase tourist arrival. But I think the industry also has to do something on the pricing, because I think we are selling our rooms at absolutely, my view, rubbishy prices, which then we are saying that cost is going up, and then we are unable to cover these costs and things like that. So I think overall, the direction has been given that this sector is something that will get focused on, and it's now for the industry to sort of pick that up and utilize those opportunities, and in a great way try to bring those benefits into the economy. Not to go again on the easy way. You don't want to increase tourism from 2.5 million to 5 million by giving cheap rates. You want to really make sure that they add value to the industry and to the country. So that is something that I think they need to do. There are also developments in expanding this tourism sector. I think in Punarin, they are trying to allocate 500 million for that development. So there are opportunities in this sector as well. So from a budget perspective, it is not necessarily only the revenue part that has to be focused on, the tax part that has to be focused. It also, you need to also focus on the direction and the trust industries that the government is focusing on, which then hopefully will transfer into opportunities in those industries or to those entities. The other part is, construction industry is at the moment going through a very bad time. So there is some relief in that. There are some things that have been talked in the budget, and the President mentioned about some form of partnership that is coming in, some different models that are coming in. So this hopefully will also help the construction industry, that is the construction people, as well as the good suppliers to the construction, like the tiles, the aluminium and things like that as well. If the construction industry moves up, then obviously those ancillary industries also will be able to piggyback on that development and the growth momentum. Of course, the export sector, I think the strategy has been in order to develop trade agreements rather than giving incentives. Once again, this incentive story was discussed this morning as to there were no tax concessions for the export industry. That seems to be the trust. This is something that, this is my personal view, but these incentives, I think when you give incentives, people have to realize that the people who get the incentives, there is a cost of this incentive which is borne by someone else. There are no free lunches in this equation. It's an equation. You give incentives on one side, someone else has to bear the cost. Now, the people who are bearing the cost, these incentives must yield a return which is greater than the cost that you're bearing. I don't think those KPIs have been put through. People just keep talking about incentives, and if there are no incentives, you can't move forward. My personal view is that, yes, we have to incentivize certain industries because there are certain hurdles that they have to go. But then those industries must then yield something more than because it has to yield more than the cost of what those incentives are. So people think that is giving incentives easy because in the end of the day, in the economy, you give incentives on one side, there is a cost that has to be borne by someone else. So you reduce tax rates to some industry, then someone has to pay a higher tax rate to compensate for that loss. So there is, I think, that part of the equation. Listening to many of these panelists and panels and all that, sometimes I get the impression we don't seem to understand this. So this is where Suji also mentioned, for the last 7 years we have been giving on borrowed funds. So they think that the incentives can be, you can borrow and give incentives, which you can, provided once again that borrowing has, you have the incentives must give a return much greater than that borrowing. If that doesn't happen, why are we giving incentives? So I think you need to put this whole equation together, and then I'm sure there is a positive answer to this, but it's just that we are only looking at one side of the equation and not necessarily the other side of the equation. So these are things I think that has to get addressed to some extent. So the export sector has been addressed. The banking sector has been addressed. Now there again, I think we were discussing this. There are two or three areas that they are looking at. One is the 450 billion or whatever it is has been allocated for recapitalization. This is to strengthen the banking sector. I presume that primarily most of this is going to go into the state banks. It's not clear, but I think that's where the goals are, primarily, if at all, because of the SOE lending and things like that. But in addition to that, there is a positive note. Again, from the stock exchange point of view, the positive note is that the two state banks are up for how should I say, peopleizing or whatever it is, where you can bring in a strategic investor with a 20% stake. It will be interesting to find out whether that 20% will go into strengthen the bank, whereby the capital raise goes into the banks where it can strengthen the banks. But whatever method, I think through that, the capital markets also can be used there to raise this capital, which will make the stock market also a good place for you to raise this capital. So that's a good initiative, I think, from the budget point of view, where now raising capital means that you don't necessarily go into the financial service sector, but you also go into the capital markets as well. So those were the sort of critical initiatives that the government, the budget seems to have taken. I think a lot of people are to somewhat disappointed that tax rates have not necessarily come back, or the allowances have not been increased with today's inflation and cost of living areas or whatever it is. But I think, as the ST mentioned, sometimes these are not normal times. We will have to go through some degree of pain before we enjoy the benefits, because we have been enjoying the benefits for the last 70 years. Now, this is the part people forget. So now I think it has come to bite us in some form or the other. And so we need to stabilize our economy, put it into the right place. But one other just final comment that I want to make is that, to take Sujiva's point, was about this policy framework. I have a feeling that this policy framework is the biggest problem in this country, because we have a 5-year political reset. So when you have a 5-year political reset, you can rest assured you cannot have long-term or medium-term policies, because each fellow will come and change this for the benefit of politics or votes or whatever it is. So this is going to be the biggest issue. And what Sujiva mentioned about the VAT rates and things like that, again, this is all politics. So until we can get some mechanism or bring in some mechanism whereby people can't play around with some of these policy directions, we are still going to have this complication. And finally, Suji's point about the military and all, I think this country has a bigger problem which no one is addressing. The bigger problem is an unemployment problem. It's not about education. It's about education, obviously, education, health, and all of that. But I think there's when I call unemployment problem, employability problem. So the issue is we produce something like, I think, 500,000 people who come onto the job market. These coming, if you look at the O-level numbers or A-level numbers, you can see that 500,000 out of that, about 190,000 qualify as A-level students, and out of the 190, about 40,000 goes to the universities. The rest of it, they are going to various things. So this expanding the university network is a great thing, so that now we will give opportunities for these balanced guys to get educated. But the question is, do we create that many number of jobs? Now, every year, these fellows are coming into the job market. So part of this problem of the government is that they keep absorbing these people into the government, because otherwise you have to end up paying them some form of unemployment benefit or something, or these guys get into mischief. So our economy, whether it can absorb and whether we have a strategy, a comprehensive strategy, in order to absorb these people when they come out. So that's, I think, the bigger problem, and everyone is tinkering around on the surface, but not really addressing the root cause of the problem and really creating that. So with that, I will stop, Shamsa, and we will take up questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Manil. Indeed, there's a lot of interest about the bank recapitalization program. Also, perhaps we can pose some of those questions to Deshal after we've gone through the round of opening remarks. So thank you, Manil. And Kingsley Bernard, Chairman of the EDB, may I invite you to make your opening remarks?
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate as a panelist. And also, I must thank the Central Bank for organizing this online discussion. Let me focus a little bit more on the export side, export and investment side. Previous speakers have spoken on the same subject as well, but let me be little deal with little more details about it, using from the budget proposals. Now, it is very clear that the government strategy is export-led investment, because if you look at the revenue side, exports and investments are of great interest. So therefore, government has realized the importance of export-led investment strategy, because all these days, I think we have not paid much attention to this strategy. So in order to achieve or implement this strategy, government has proposed from the budget itself, the merging of number of organizations where they do the same kind of overlapping functions. For example, BUI, Export Development Board, the Industrial Development Board, and also NEDA, that is National Enterprise Development Authority. So if you look at these four organizations, there is a lot of overlapping of functions. Now, those functions have to be carried out efficiently and also speedily. So in order to do that, government has made a proposal in the budget to merge these organizations and work towards enterprise development. Now, in these organizations, as at now, because of lack of coordination, there's a lot of inefficiency and cost involved. So by setting one organization to take care of the activities of these four organizations, I think government has a clear plan to implement the export-led investment. Further, they also have suggested an economic commission to take care of international trade. That means FTAs and bilateral trade agreements, one specialized arm of that, and also investment promotion, and also investment facilitation of the investment. So these structural changes are necessary because as a result of number of organizations working in the same area, there had been a lot of delays when approving certain investments, identifying them, promoting them. There had been certain delays in doing so. Ease of doing business was not very high in this country. So therefore, by introducing a new structure, a new organization, I think the efficiency of these operations will go up. As a result of that, we may be able to invite and also get the attention of the world famous investors, because if we can get a couple of global brands into Sri Lanka to operate in our market, I think that will give a lot of impetus to develop our investment and exports. So therefore, that is a very good development and also a good decision which the government has already made. Then the SME sector, now at the moment, their contribution is around 52% to the GDP. Now there is a lot of potential to increase this as well as increase their contribution to the exports. Now, if you take these SMEs, their contribution to the exports is about 10%. So therefore, there is a lot of room for improvement. So now one major bottleneck or the issue that the SME sector has is the inadequacy of capital. Now, in this budget, it has been proposed to give a substantial amount of money or finances to give loans, concessionary loans to these SMEs. Now, if you look at the SMEs right now, they are the worst affected business sector in this country because of the VAT increases and also the cost of electricity and cost of funds. And they don't have, actually, if you look at the IT sector, BPM sector, most of these are startups, and also they don't have the financial resources. If they can be supported by offering low cost funds, then they should be able to increase their exports and also improve their organizations. So therefore, that's a very good development. And also connected to that, the education sector. Now, if you look at the services sector in Sri Lanka, we can increase the service exports tremendously. And we have a lot of potential, and also we have the know-how and also the expertise. So therefore, by identifying certain higher education institutes, special all those 4 institutions were named, and all those 4 institutions are private sector oriented ones. So by introducing and also by making their status to the university, I think we should be able to attract foreign students to these organizations. And if you compare Sri Lanka to the other countries, certain facilities offered to foreign students in Sri Lanka is much less than that of our neighboring countries even. So if you look at the developed countries, I think they offer much more than what we are offering or what the third world countries are offering. So therefore, we should be able to improve this sector very much. And also, on top of this, I think we need to have a attitudinal change towards investment and exports. So whenever new investments comes, we need to look at in a positive manner and also the benefits out of it, rather than looking at the negative aspects of it. So therefore, in developing the education and the IT BPM sector, these proposals are very positive, and it would give a lot of results. And also connected to that, digitalization, because through digitalization, we can improve our efficiency very much. And also, since all those are connected, we should be able to take decisions, say, in a equitable manner, and also speedily. So therefore, digitalization should go ahead. And also, world is going through globalization. Globalization will never come back, or it will never return. So therefore, we have to work with them, and with the globalization and the IT development, and also deregulation. All those three phenomena are working very fast in the fast developing world. So therefore, without digitalization, we may not be able to compete in the world markets and the global markets. So these are some positives. And also, I would have wished to see some developments in the development banking. It's a welcoming session to recapitalize these banks. But in addition to that, venture banking is lacking in this country. So therefore, I think the government should pay attention on those development banking. So if that is done, then most of these newcomers, new enterprises can develop themselves. So let me stop at this point, and then we can answer the questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kingsley Bernard, for those opening remarks. Lastly, may I ask Bingumal Devarathantli, CEO of Standard Started in Sri Lanka, for your opening remarks.
Yes, Shamin, a lot being said, so I will briefly cover a few things. I think the elephant in the room is debt restructure. We all need to understand we are in default. I think the budget has tried to address some of these concerns, and more importantly, being on course and following the IMF guidelines in terms of fiscal targets, etc. Our view is it's very optimistic on the fiscal side. We don't want to make a lot of comments at this point, but definitely first half next year is going to be extremely challenging. But once you cross the debt restructuring, what can happen is you get rating upgrade, and the low hanging fruits like the BOI pipeline will get activated. Some investments will come. The SOE reforms will take off. You'll see some investments coming in, and things can change because we've seen the change from last year to this year, how Sri Lanka has stabilized the economy. Now, comparatively, Sri Lanka, if you compare some of the other markets that continue to default, I think Sri Lanka has done extremely well in terms of debt negotiations, etc. So from that perspective, we are cautiously optimistic. I think what we have to now do is, one is the low hanging, the BOI pipeline. We have to carefully look at the FDI pipeline we have, because that's the first thing we should do in terms of getting investments in. And there's a massive opportunity for green finance. I think budget also covered on the green economy. And this is more into wind power. So without trying to do 10 things, if we focus only on that, this is more for the medium term. But the opportunity is much larger, because we don't see the export basket going from $1 billion for a month to $2 billion anytime soon organically, unless we getting into market expanding FDIs. So we strongly recommend that we carefully look at the wind opportunity we have, because we heard about 40 gigawatts opportunity in the North Mana and North that patch offshore and onshore. Of course, you'll have to export. We have to make sure that we carefully structure these agreements in terms of royalties, in terms of taxes. But that's a low-hanging fruit for Sri Lanka, and there's a best kept secret actually, because we are, I think, in the top 5 in the world for in terms of capacity on the wind power. On the digitization, everybody spoke. All what I'm asking is, as private sector, as banking sector, we would like to see some kind of a milestone report. Now we have RFP. I think we found few suppliers. We need to understand, when are we awarding this? When are we doing the first set of data gathering? Can we have some kind of a tracking mechanism so private sector is fully aware of what's going to happen on the digital ID? Because that's the way to go for broadening. On the government sector, I think Sujua touched on the 1.3 million government sector. There had been many discussions around practicality in terms of reducing people, because government unions and the contracts are very, very firm. You can't fire people. but can't we repurpose? Can't we put them on short-term assignments in inner revenue to collect more taxes? So we have 1.3 billion, 3 million people, and I think we have definitely about 400,000 excess. How can we best use these resources, in the verticals that we want to drive? So that would be one more, suggestion from our side, because these are like available resources. You're also increasing the salaries that are there. It's a matter of getting them to do some extra work or some work for that matter. Trade, I think, yeah, Dr. Kingsley spoke about trade. We are asking for a single window for trade. This has been driven by the Ceylon Chamber as well. And in terms of treaties, I think it's very important that we work on RCEP. I know we are trying to do many things. There's a Thailand treaty in the pipeline. If one treaty, if I can sign, I'll go and sign RCEP. It's not an easy one to do. It's very complex, but we have to get RCEP right, because South-South trade has now gone into something like 28% of the global trade from 15% in 2017. So numbers have really gone up in South-South trade, and we have to, tap that opportunity. Of course, the India treaty and China treaty also will be important. While we do all these revenue stuff, trying to collect revenue, being on course to achieve IMF targets, it's important that we, follow the non-fiscal initiatives and cover some of those, because we already have 1.3 million government sector. So we cannot say we don't have enough people to set up anything for that matter. I'm sure there are a lot of, educated people in that pool of, government resources. One last thing, Shamin Bhai, I also know that we are running out of time. We would like to have an independent authority for tax administration. We always come up with policy frameworks for tax, but the administration had been very, very weak. Of course, we have RAMIS. We have so many things that we have to implement in the next 18 months. I think we need an independent authority looking at what's going to happen and how some of these taxpayers by being treated and bailed out. So it's very, very important that we improve governance on the whole tax administration piece, and also a whistleblower policy for inner revenue as well, because we cannot say that, we are unable to collect the taxes, because just in a nutshell, I think we collect 97 of the taxes from something like 1,000 plus, taxpayers. That's not sustainable. I'll stop there, Shaminta. Thanks.
Thank you. And I will just once again remind those who are online with us, if you're on Zoom, you can post questions on the Q&A tab of Zoom. Please make your questions brief, and if you can suggest to whom we may want to direct them to. I'll invite the panel to perhaps switch on your cameras, and I'll start with you. I'll start with a few questions. I'll start with you, Deshal. There is also a question for us online on this, and it's about banking, and I'll pose three questions on that. One of which I'm picking up from the Zoom Q&A, and that is, in the event of state banks being divested by 20% to a strategic investor, will they adopt articles of association instead of the existing statutes? That's question number one. In the question number two would be in this process of attracting a strategic investor, does the government currently intend to sell down its stake, or list these entities, or ask a new investor to subscribe to newly issued shares? If there is a question number three, no, I'll ask you to first address those two questions, and we'll get to the others.
Yeah. So, Shamitra, I think it's mature to look at the specifics. I think that would need to be worked out in terms of the modalities of how this would be executed. So there are a number of options on the table, and that's also why we don't have say a specific number in the budget on non-tax revenue, something like that, because that all needs to be worked out in terms of how exactly this would be rolled out. I think it's important that the budget sets out the policy intention, both in terms of the plans for the divestment, but also importantly in terms of the revenue, in terms of the governance measures that would be done in parallel. Because really, in terms of being able to attract investment, you need to be able to convince potential investors that the entities in question are going to be run in a way that's been different to the past, in terms of risk management, in terms of appointment of KMPs, and in terms of appointments of board and all that. All that needs to be set in place as kind of in parallel to the process of the divestment itself. And the amendments to the Banking Act are now ongoing. I believe by January we expect that to get sent up to Parliament, and then that the amendments to the Banking Act will really give the legislative framework to bring in these governance improvements as well. But yeah, in a nutshell, the specifics in terms of the modalities of the divestment need to be worked out, and I think in due course that will be shared.
The 450 billion earmarked for recapitalization. It's a large amount of money in comparison to the size of the budget. Will this be exclusively available just to the state banks, or will large private sector banks also be able to tap this money?
We expect it to be used predominantly for the state banks. We don't see much requirement beyond that. The state banks are the ones that have been the most affected mainly by the domestic debt optimization exercise. So that's really the primary usage.
Right. Bingu, can I bring you in here? How can you think the banks help or participate in helping to widen the tax nets? Some proposals were mentioned in the budget, like requiring transactions of a certain size to be channeled through the banking system. But if you look at this issue broadly, can banks help in widening the tax net?
Yeah, Shamin. So I think there's one proposal also to make sure that you ask for a TIN number when you open a current account. Now that's a very good suggestion, but it's very common in other markets as well. I think even now we have that in the mandate, but it's not a mandatory field. I think it is also important that we cap the cash. I think that's to be done with the regulators. I think we have to come up with a cash cap. A lot of the countries have a cap for cash transactions. For Sri Lanka, it should not be anything more than 200,000. Should be a bank transfer or a check or something like that. Because we have the SWIFT, we have millions of debit cards, we have Lanka QR, we have many ways of doing these transactions. So cash cap is critical. We have a 500,000 cap at the moment in terms of related to tax, but I think that's not effective because people do a lot of cash transactions at the moment. The other thing is, especially in the corporates, the partnerships and the corporates, they produce two books. So they have a nice audited financials, set of audited financials, and a management book. So we look at the audited financials, maybe most of the time is a loss-making entity or a very low profit, low turnover. You have a management book with all the net worth and the right profit and all that. So banks look at the management book and lend. This is a practice in Sri Lanka, sadly. So there should be very clear-cut guidelines in terms of if there are discrepancies, you can put a threshold like 5% or whatever, immediately report, red flag, price up, exit, and report to central bank. Central bank will report to CA and other authorities and will blacklist that audit firm. That's the way we should work with some of these mom and pop audit firms that are around the country, because it's a serious problem for Sri Lanka. I think that has to be fixed. The other important thing is, again, there's a guideline on this, but the practice is still not there. Clients routing their business transactions on personal accounts. So if you go to any, like in lower end of the pyramid, like they run, wife will have one business, husband will have another business, the hardware stores, petrol sheds, they run those businesses on personal accounts. Money would come to personal account. So it's a serious problem, and there should be some serious, I mean, the guideline is already there, but we need to take some serious action on this one, because if we entertain business transactions on personal accounts, you will never find the right turnover. And of course, working with Ramis with inner revenue, I think the inner revenue bill is now amended. If they ask for data, we have to submit data. I think banking sector should come forward. In the past, we've been pushing back in terms of sharing data, and we used to only share specific data. I think time is up, because we can't run with these limited, taxpayers and run this fiscal deficit. We're going to fail miserably, in my view, if we don't broaden the tax. And that should be like every quarter, there should be like strict targets, and these targets should be communicated to the committees as well, business as well as the chamber, so we know what's happening.
May I bring the two accountants on the panel, Manil and Sujeeva, on this? Deshal was quite confident about hopefully Sri Lanka's ability to hit the revenue target. I mean, that's in everybody's interest, I suppose, that Sri Lanka be able to hit that target. If you were looking at risk factors, that may prevent Sri Lanka from hitting these numbers, or if in the budgeting we have made assumptions that somehow you feel aren't absolutely on point, would you mind highlighting some of those to us, risk factors and shortfalls in assumptions? Manil, may you?
Yeah.
Shall I ask you to go first?
So I think listening to Deshal, I'm how should I say, a little more confident in what they're achieving, because he actually went to where they're going to come, this money is going to come from. So it is a good part of it is coming from the 3% hike of VAT. So I'm sure they can easily predict that number, and also expanding the base, which is getting rid of all these exemptions and things like that. So to some extent, I would have thought that that number is how should I say, predictable, rather than saying that you're going to bring in new taxpayers into the tax net or something like that. Now that could be sort of a problematic area. But one of the area that I feel the sort of doubt is that, you know, we are assuming that in 2024 the profitability and results that will show by the company will continue in the same momentum as 23. Now 23 I think had a knock-on effect from 22. Now, if these companies start bottoming out because of the import restrictions and all these things like that, whether they will have the same levels of earnings, I'm not too sure. That's from income tax point of view. I think that's a little bit of the question mark, if at all. Whether the estimates are based on a certain base, right? So the question is whether you can maintain that base going forward is the question. So that is one area. But I think they are relatively conservative in the sense that they have predicted the 3% increase. They have predicted the base expansion, and then bulk of this 1 trillion or whatever increase, which is about 40% is coming from these sources as opposed to the existing source. So I'm with Deshal to some extent that there is some reasonable, how should I say, grounds to say that you might achieve these targets. Also, there are two factors, because when you're looking at 23 didn't have a lot of things like I'm sure customs duties and all were low because imports are restricted. So those, if those starts to open out, those sources will also start coming. But they are, one of the things that you have to be careful is about these revenue leaks. You know, now I think the president also mentioned, the ST also mentioned this whole thing about whether we are getting what is due to us, because fellows are playing around with the values and various things like that. So those leaks have to be sorted out from an administration point of view. So if those are there, I think you can achieve these numbers. So I don't know. So you might have a different view, but one thing what Bingu mentioned on a couple of things about these dual sets of books and all. Yes, I think there has to be something that has been brought in. I think the bankers also have to play their role, because I don't think they are really insisting on these to be sort of verified or assured by reasonable people. Some fellow comes and gives a set of accounts, sign, they accept it. I can remember in the 80s when I was doing banking at that time, one of the foreign banks said that we don't rely on numbers, we rely on the LCs that are opened in order to determine how much, because these are big sugar traders in PETA, which don't have any sets of books for that matter. So Sri Lanka, one of the biggest problems I foresee to bring in even this digitalization and all that, we have a huge cash economy. Because there is a hell of a lot of people who are daily paid, who don't have bank accounts. Meaning, how do they trade? How do they sort of do their day-to-day transactions? So I think there are a lot of moving parts in this, which has to be put together in order to achieve what you say. The way to go forward is the digital economy. But given our, how should I say, strata, I think you need to put a plan and try and get the people moving towards that.
Sujiva, can I bring you in on the same question? You know, how confident are you that the estimates are based on sound assumptions as far as revenue increase is concerned?
So for me, unlikely. I mean, I don't think those numbers can be achieved. Unless I'll give you a couple of reasons. But before I get in there, just to add on to what Bingu said on how the banking sector can help, I have a couple of other suggestions. One thing is that when we are issuing a credit card, we should ask for a tax file number. Easy one. We have 1.5 million credit cards. Straight away, So some people may have 2 or 3, but roughly easily 500,000 people are using credit cards. Straight away, they will come into the tax net. Easy one, right? Number 2, see Shamindra, you would have remembered whenever you go abroad, when you ask for $1,000 from the bank currency, there's a specific question: what is your tax file number? None of us fill it up because the bank say it's not required. Simple one. If you are traveling overseas and if you want currency from the bank, put your tax file number, otherwise you don't get currency. So I mean, these are straightforward ones, right? Third one, see our society, Shamindra, is you have to tax them at source. Until such time we realize that as a law-abiding citizen, we have a duty to pay taxes. Until we get into that mindset, you have to catch them at source. So what are the other areas that you can catch them to widen the taxes? There are enough things, but for some reason, politicians are generally, they don't like to do this because, they are very unpopular. So I'll give you a few other things. You tell me today whether you can send your kids to a private school if you are not a taxpayer. Easy one. All these people who are sending kids to private schools, I think there could be easily 100,000 kids in private schools. Right? They should be paying taxes. Catch them at source. Number 1. Number 2, can you buy see the 4 common destinations that people travel out of Sri Lanka is Dubai, Singapore, Malaysia, and Bangkok. Every day there are 10 flights going out. At least two outbound flights. 200 per flight. Right? 2,000 people are traveling to these destinations. Can you buy if you're not paying a taxpayer today? Don't issue a air ticket. If you don't have a tax, unless you are going for employment to the Middle East or any of these places, you should not be able to buy and like those days, the embarkation tax was, can remember it was with the ticket. Travel agents used to collect it. I mean, you can't buy air ticket if you're not having a tax file, right? So there are enough ways that you can, if you want to. Well, these are unpopular measures, but I agree with Bingu and Manil. If you don't expand the net, what will happen? You'll have to do the same thing what you did with the VAT rate. Take it from 15 to 18. Come next year, we say we are 20%. Because that's the easiest thing to do, is change the rate. Stroke of a pen, you are collecting more money. One other thing, Shamil, you need to understand, I think people have not realized this. See, the VAT is going to get higher income on 3 fronts. I think Deshal touched on this. First one is the rate. I think the quantum could be as big as the rate is on this removal of the exemptions, as Manil mentioned. Right? The main thing is that government is silent whether this energy and the fuel is going to be brought in, because the estimate is that this could be 50 billion alone on those sectors if they are brought in. Because the wording is vague. Wording says health, education, and few essential food items. So technically, power and energy is excluded. So that will be a big impact on the average person on the road. If that is brought into the VAT net, and that could be a big ticket item. And also the threshold is been brought down to 60 million. Right? Again, you will see the policy consistency. We were at 12 million. Then we took it up to, I don't know, 80 or something. Now it's coming down to 60. I think at one point 300 or something, or 120. I mean, it has over the last 3-4 years, we've had 4 different thresholds. So that is one. Just one other quick point on this is, see, what we are doing with taxation is we are taking money away from the private sector, and through taxes we are giving it to the government to be spent on salaries, pensions, and interest. Nothing else, right? Salaries, pensions, and interest. So funds that is available for investment, product development, growing markets, and so on, you are just taking away. In my view, it's an inefficient transfer of funds. So you need to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Deshal, there is a question for you also, and this links back to what Sujiva was also talking about, the VAT exemptions. The budget wording Sujiva mentioned, it says it's food, healthcare, education. Can you shed some more light? For instance, is electricity and water going to be VAT liable in that sense?
So the amendment to the bill is in Parliament. It's just been submitted now for the second reading as well. The Minister of Finance has also submitted the committee stage amendments to that also. So I think it will come out to the public domain in a matter of days. As soon as that gets the second reading then comes out into Gazette. I don't think I'm in a place to speak about that in more detail at this stage, but I think in a very short time it will be out in the public domain.
Again, it was expected by many that the withholding tax rate may be increased. Sujiva was talking about the efficiency of taxing at source. Withholding tax is at 5%. I don't think that rate was touched. I'm sure this was among the sort of bunch of proposals that you had to on enhancing revenue. It took, I think, many people by surprise.
Yeah, so withholding it's not a final tax, right? So people who are anyway above that would have to file and pay the balance. So really, this is going to an increase in the rate is going to affect people who are below the threshold, and then that can become quite regressive. So somebody who's on a retiree who's on say 50,000 rupee per month interest income, you're going to get back 10% on the entirety of that if you're withholding taxes that unless you get refunds. Now the IRD doesn't have a system where refunds are efficient and easy to manage. So you're going to have a very large administrative burden by trying to do this without a significant revenue impact because it is not a final tax. So that is why that was the trade-off that you had in mind in terms of thinking that through. And typically, I believe withholding taxes are generally at a low rate with the idea of capturing more people into the base and identifying potential payers. So that's the way that was considered.
Also, since we are discussing how the rationale behind certain tax proposals, the president had earlier indicated that there may be a tax on bond profits. Banks and also primary dealers, which are also some of them non-banks, it was anticipated that there may be a capital gains tax of some sort or a special tax. There was a market expectation, and I think some of these assets may have been priced, taken into account the impact of such. This was the finance minister who earlier said that such a tax could potentially be anticipated. Again, I'm just wondering how that played out.
So I can give my personal view on this. I think any measure of that nature would have to be retrospective in basis, right? We have to make a change to the taxability of an instrument that at the time of transaction was a different tax regime.
Sure.
And I think our track record in terms of retrospective taxes has not been ideal. We have the surcharge on corporate income tax from 22, I believe, and then before that you had the super gains tax. In general, I think any kind of retrospective measure is detrimental to in terms of the investment environment. I think Sujiva made the point that certainty and clarity, I think, is really important in terms of any investment decision. So any measure that is retrospective is contrary to those principles. So I think that is one of the reasons why there was a reluctance to go down that road.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sort of taking these questions. There's a question online from a former central banker, if it is right, to Kingsley Bernard. So this is the question. What is the logic of replacing 4 overlapping entities, the BOI, EDB, NEDA, with 2 overlapping entities, a commission and an agency? Why not give responsibility to one for export development? Why not one instead of now proposed 2 versus the 4 that we have?
The answer is now, if you look at the first 4 institutions I mentioned, those are institutions which are more in the local market, developing enterprises. The others are more in the international and the global markets. So that is the difference. So if you take 4 organizations, there are certain functions which are overlapping and some are not overlapping. Now, if you take Industrial Development Board, the local enterprise development is one of their major functions. But at the same time, they also get involved in certain promotional measures overseas also. So therefore, those are not four organizations putting into two. Those functions are clearly different. So if you take Economic Commission, the activities under Economic Commission are completely different to that of the other four organizations. So that is my answer to that question.
Sure,
Thank you.
sure. Thank you for that. Deshal, I'll bring you in again in preparing these estimates of revenue and expenditure. You would have to have made several assumptions about economic growth, about where the Sri Lankan rupee will trade towards with the dollar, over a period of 1 year, and several other assumptions. In the current climate, which of these assumptions do you think were the most difficult to make, because they have a bearing on the outturn of the budget? And we've, as has already been discussed over the years, we've not had a great track record on budget outturns. Primarily, I suppose, because also our assumptions were misinformed. When you looked at the assumptions you had to make, which were the most challenging ones in this current context?
Good question, Shamindra. I think so. If you look at the experience this year for 2023, it was a much more difficult task than it is for 2024, right? Because we had the very large level of inflation was something that was very difficult to predict, and the relevant impact on the currency resulting from that also. And last year there was, I think, nobody expected the disinflation path to be as quick as it actually turned out to be. So next year, I think in terms of inflation, there's a little bit more clarity in terms of where that's going to be. We know it's going to be in the mid-single digit kind of level. In terms of growth, there of course can be a little bit of variation, whether it's going to be 3%, 5%, 1.5%. But again, here I think what we can converge on is the fact that it's very likely to be a positive growth in 2024. I would say the variable that is the most tricky might be on the forex side, because you are seeing quite a few changes to the environment with regard to forex. In terms of the removal import restrictions, so you're going to see a normalization of imports, which you haven't had for the last couple of years. And then secondly, in terms of the central bank's requirement to collect reserves, they'll have to be purchasing from the market as well. The inflows of foreign financing, again, that's a difficult one to predict. So there's quite a lot of variables in terms of the different drivers of forex. Again, current account, you're likely to see a big improvement on or continued improvement on the tourism side. So all of these variables will have competing impacts on forex. So I would say that is the trickiest of the variables to predict for 2024.
Question on potentially normalizing imports. One that hasn't been allowed as yet is vehicles, and vehicles attract high border taxes, and also there's a component of VAT and other consumption taxes that apply on vehicles. So there are various estimates, and I suppose if you go back in time, you can figure versus a certain CIF value in the import of vehicles, what are the revenues that you can collect. Has a liberalization of vehicle imports been budgeted in the estimates that you have provided for 2024? Has that been budgeted in at any point?
No, so I think one of the challenging things of this crisis is the interaction between the different reform measures, right? So if it was only the Ministry of Finance, no other variables to consider, opening up vehicles would be absolute no-brainer. It's a very large source of revenue. But the challenge that you have is we also have to make sure that the reserve build-up targets will also be manageable. Can also be kept on track. Now, given the variables that we spoke about earlier, you want to reduce the risks do that. So really, what we're looking at in terms of or in terms of vehicles is to taking a wait and see approach until you have a better clarity in terms of the evolution of the external environment before making a call on that. I think another important factor to keep in mind is that with the DDO in particular, and to an extent the external debt restructuring, there will also be impacts on the network composition of the banking sector. So that again is something that has to be factored in terms of the overall BOP management. So all of these things have to be balanced, which is why the delay in the opening up of the vehicle market. Specifically to your question, there hasn't been a revenue item hasn't been factored in because there's too much uncertainty with regard to the timing and the volumes given the current situation.
Okay, to everybody listening in, we have just a few minutes more to go. So if there are any last minute questions, please go ahead, put them on the Q&A, make them very brief. Manil, I'll bring you in on bank recapitalization, and we're going back there, right? As an accountant, you've been an expert around banking and among so one of the areas that potentially need to be looked at in such a recapitalization is the impact on core capital, tier 2 capital, and also liquidity, right? There are various instruments potentially a government can use. There are various levels of instruments that the government can use that affect both the capital and the liquidity in various ways. If you take a approach to this, from your experience and from what you know of how state banks are currently positioned, how should the government approach recapitalization, both from a core capital point of view and also from a liquidity point of
view? So there are two aspects. I think this is my personal view. There are three areas that banking there are three things which is obvious that the banking industry will have to go through. I think one is some form of consolidation has to happen. The second one is there has to be like an AMC that has been created now. This is addressing some part of your liquidity issue as well. The asset management company or SPV or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but basically the ability for banks to take out non-performing assets and sell it or push it out to another entity is something. This was done in the 90s as well, but it never got properly established. Two state banks went through this equation, and there was a move, but due to certain other laws, intervening laws, which didn't permit the transfer of assets to a management company, asset management company, it never really succeeded. But that will have to happen. Now, that if that happens, there will be a release of liquidity because you will sell it to the AMC, and then the AMC will settle the loan, because currently there are non-earning assets which are in the balance sheets of these banks illiquid. Earning or not is one issue, and one is illiquid. So that's the second part that has to happen. So consolidation, AMC, and then obviously the recapitalization, because I also feel that if banks have a reasonable degree of provisioning, but there are some inbuilt risks inside these portfolios which are not getting out. Sometimes because of these moratoriums and various things like that, these are getting recycled inside the system. So like Sujio mentioned about the 700 billion debt to the hotel industry. Now these are all inside there getting recycled. Now, whether there is an actual loss that has to be taken in or not in this, sometimes not, because you are having cash flows and whatever it is, and it is getting sort of, how should I say, hidden to some extent. So this is all a function of the economy also. If the economy starts to pick up, and then some of these things will obviously get sorted out. Now you can see that the non-performing advances are coming down. It hit about 9 to 10%. It's now slightly coming down, but again, it's a function of the economic performance. The businesses run in the economy. So from a liquidity point of view, I think going forward, there will be some challenges because of the the cost of cost of living and all these things will go into the disposable income. Disposable income ultimately ends up the ability for people to save and for the banks to keep mobilizing the savings will be an issue. So going forward, if the economy picks up and things move on, then that may not be too much of a issue as such. But this liquidity part, from what I know of the market, everyone is not having this problem. Certain people are having. I think the two, probably the state banks had this at a particular time purely because the government was sitting and taking the money from them. So obviously they had a liquidity issue. So it varies from bank to bank. It depends on how they are managing this also. The other issue would be how the government is intended to settle some of these debts. So by issuing, whether they are issuing bonds for settlement, or government recently issued, I think, bonds for that senior citizens settlement of senior citizens amount. So then the question is whether these bonds are again liquid, whether they can actually go to the markets and convert these bonds into realize these bonds as such. What you call the construction industries is being given a lot of bonds here and there. So it all depends on how liquid these instruments ultimately will be. But I think the banking industry will have to go through some form of reorganization or whatever it is. I believe that we have too many banks in the market. We need to consolidate. I think Dr. Kingsley also raised that we don't have development type banking in the market. That most of them are commercial banks, so none of them are specializing in SME type lending. So there are some, how should I say, reorganization that has happened. And I think in the initial part I mentioned, banking is the lifeline of an economy. If you don't get that equation right, the economy won't move. And if the economy doesn't move, all this what we are talking about here is of no use.
Sure. I will bring Bingumal and Sujeev on this. I'll ask you to both briefly comment on this, and Sri Lanka will have to count on its financial sector, the banks and the capital market to help in this revival of the economy, so that economic activity picks up, and then that can generate the additional tax revenue, both in income taxes and sales taxes, right? Banks can play a big role here. The healthy banking system can play a big role here. And one of the criticisms of that system have been that, banks have not been supportive of SMEs over the last couple of years during this crisis. Bingu, is that fair criticism? We have this analogy of banks give you the umbrella when the sun is shining and take it away as soon as the rain starts.
I cannot agree with that comments. I mean, completely, because from 2019, banks have been giving moratoriums, and bank had some serious challenges trying to account for those with IFRS guidelines, etc. So since 19, we've been giving moratoriums running into 4 years now. But the point that Sujeev made recently, on a call, I was also there about, this whole tourism sector moratorium, that book ballooning to like 100% from the previous level without even any tourism. I think what has happened is, of course, there are clients who got the moratorium settled and they are on the path to recovery. Some actually did other things with the money and thought that they don't have to settle, so they are willful defaulters. But there's, I think, a larger pool where they restructured, but they genuinely can't pay. So because we capitalize the interest, and we capitalize the interest in a time where the interest rates are very high. So if you have now restructured a loan at 20%, you definitely have a massive cash outflow, and there's no space for you to recover. So I think that is individual banks. Again, you can't really put like a program for those clients. Those clients will have to come forward. Banks will have to come forward. Banks have a larger responsibility, in my view, to look at those stressed clients who are, clients you can salvage. Now, there are certain clients who are like gone. I mean, their business models are failing, sadly. So clients who can salvage, you have to go and offer them something, and maybe restructure again. Now these again got other IFRS issues and all of that, but still we might have to do it. Our NPLs are on 13%. We believe that we hit the bottom, but within the 13%, the what we have, and outside the 13%, what we have, and how toxic the portfolio is, only time will say. In another 6 to 9 months time, there'll be again another wave of stress coming our way. So prudent thing is to proactively approach these clients. Now about the AMC, very quickly, there was a proposal for a bad bank in the last budget. This budget, I don't see the bad bank. AMC, the problem is, I mean, not a problem. You need capital for the MC as well. So there should be a framework, capital coming in. We need to work with the ADBs of the world. And then the other problem is, if you take markets like India, they set up a MC and they actually put few large clients into that. If I'm not mistaken, some 12 big corporates. And in Sri Lanka's problem is more SMEs. Now you see thousands of SMEs coming to this AMC, and how you manage that, all that will be a very cumbersome process. Only in few countries we've seen success stories like Spain and Indonesia. In a lot of the cases, these bad banks have failed. So we are a bit not pessimistic, but you have to be cautious. If you are setting up a bad bank in terms of roles and responsibilities. But what can really help is, like, if there is a insolvency and bankruptcy law, for both sides, clients can say, sorry, I can't settle. I'm not in a position to settle. I want to trigger bankruptcy. Here's the process. Okay, get into a 6 months period, you restructure. And also, very importantly, a multi-creditor approach, because now we see suddenly one bank got a mortgage, they go ahead and do parate. There's another bank without a mortgage, they lose out. So I think a multi-credit approach is something I think the World Bank also have recommended. I think Central Bank is looking at that. I think that those frameworks would be critical in the next 6 months. I think 6 to 9 months. So it's very, very important that we work together and revive what we can revive. Sadly, some will, go out of business.
Deshal informs me that he's having some connection issues. He may try to come back. Sujiva, any quick comments on that? We are slightly over time. I do realize that, but we have a fair audience online.
Yeah. So
briefly.
So quick point is that, see, over the years, what has happened, the governments have not been truthful. See, what they were doing was part of the budget deficit, they were hiding inside the SOEs. There's a petroleum or CB or Sri Lanka or wherever it's Satos or railways or whatever it is. And then what do we do in turn? We go and park it in the two state banks, right? So it's a major achievement for President Wickremesinghe to make this proposal of this 450 billion, to come out and say, look, we have a problem and I'm allocating 450 billion rupees. So it's an excellent initiative and long overdue, if I would say. I mean, this should have been done many, many years ago. So that is excellent, number one. So number two is that just on this, because the tourism is always been spoken as the low-hanging fruit, right? See, in 2018, the tourism sector debt was 300 billion, and that is before Easter Sunday attacks, COVID, and this public protests and so on. 2022, it has gone to 600. 300 became 600. This year, it will be 700. By the time you and I speak again, Shamindra, in 1 or 2 years' time, it will be $1 trillion, right? Say this year, they are expecting $1.5 billion from tourism. 1.5 billion is 500 billion rupees, right? $1.5 billion, 500 billion rupees. Say they use 10% of that for debt servicing, that's 50 billion. 50 billion is not enough even to pay interest on 700
interest
billion.
On that.
You just so forget about paying capital. You can't even service the interest. So that is why I've been saying that the banking sector, the tourism, the government, and all other stakeholders need to come in urgently. And I hope they shall take this on, and then create a small task force and say, come back within 3 months, tell us what needs to be done. And in my view, we need to create a fund so that the banking sector is saved at any cost, so that revenue streams come in. And then we go to a ADB or someone and say, look, can you securitize? These are the revenue sources that are coming in. We can collect it from park tickets, we can collect it from AR ticket, we can collect it from a cultural side, we can be from embarkation. I mean, there's loads of ways that we can collect about $1 each. We need to see how to make this viable. And then, so that's why I said, so there are, I think Manila and Bingu both touched on this. You need to make sure that these toxic assets are identified, because otherwise the banks will keep on carrying this. And at some point, we need to come clean and say, look, enough is enough. We are going to address this. So I'm just talking about just tourism, but we need to make sure that whether it's construction, I mean, there are risk elevated industries, in your loan book, and so on. So one other thing which I want to say very interestingly is that, I mean, one of the reasons why there's a downturn in the economy is that the credit to the private sector has come down big time over the last 5 years. Now, Bingu and I were there today in the morning at another session. I'll just give you some numbers. 95 to 99 credit to the government was only 20% from the banking sector, 80% to the private sector. 95 to 99 credit to the private sector was 80%. By 2023, Shamindra, credit to the private sector is 43 and the government sector is 57. Can you imagine 2080 has become 57-43? More than half the amount of credit available is goes to the government because of this, for whether it's a budget deficit, whether it's a loss-making institutions, financing subsidies or whatever it is. So the private sector has got, pushed out from the equation. And also, just my final point is that because of high taxes, at some point the economy is going to contract. People, I mean, your purchasing power is dropping, the basket values are going to drop, and at some point this is going to happen. So the government needs to be really careful. You cannot keep just increasing. That's why the widening the net is so critical. You can, in my view, the rates have reached optimum levels, and I'm a firm believer that even the personal tax at 36 is too high. We can bring it down to 30%, but still make sure that there's no revenue loss. Right, a 30 and a 30 at this stage, in my view, is the ideal situation. Thank you, Shaman.
All right. I think that kind of sort of helps us wrap the discussion up. There are several questions online. Some of them deal with, why not super gains taxes, etc. We posed that question to Deshal. He expressed not a government view, but his view about retroactive taxes, etc. There are also questions about APIT, the high rates. Sujiva also just commented about that. So thank you very much for your participation. I will thank the panelists for an engaging discussion. Manil, Sujiva, Dr. Bernard, Bingumal, and of course Deshal, who's having some connection problems. Thank you very much. I will hand you over to CBS.
Yes, thank you very much, Shamindra. I think we had a very fruitful panel discussion, very interactive with the audience as well. So thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and moderator Shamindra for this very rich discussion. We had the pleasure of looking at the national budget in different aspects, thanks to this panel discussion. So on behalf of Central Bank, let me express our gratitude once again to Mr. Mahendra Siriwardana, Secretary to the Treasury of Minister of Finance, for delivering the keynote today and sharing his time and insights on the budget. And then our respected panelists, Mr. Deshal Dimel, and Mr. Mali Jayasinghe, Dr. Kingsley Bernard, Mr. Bingumal Tevaratantri, Mr. Sujiva Mudalige, Mr. Shamindra Kulamana, for joining with us and sharing your thoughts amidst your busy schedules. And further, on behalf of Director of Central Bank Studies and Central Bank, I wish to thank all of you who joined with us for this post-budget forum, without whom, at the end, this event wouldn't have been a success. So we will meet again with another timely event soon. Until that time, thank you very much once again, and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.